Less than 2 miles away from Walt Disney World in Central Florida sat a theme park being touted as Orlando's only cultural park. It was called Splendid China, and across 76 acres, it brought the history of China in the form of miniatures, shows, and restaurants to Florida. But since its opening in the early 1990s, the park was plagued by controversy and low attendance, ultimately closing for good just a decade later. But that wasn't the end of the story. What's up guys, my name is Jake, and in this 81st episode of Abandoned, we're going to take a look at this controversial theme park in Central Florida. One that failed to compete with the other entertainment giants, and one that was ultimately left completely abandoned. This episode is sponsored by Nebula. Get a monthly, annual, or lifetime membership by clicking the link in the description below. It's 1989, and the Splendid China miniature scenic spot opened in the city of Shenzhen, not too far from Hong Kong. It was the largest outdoor miniature theme park in the world, and one that was built by the Chinese Tourism Service, or CTS, which the People's Republic of China had an ownership stake in. It told the history of China through handcrafted miniatures, and was an immediate success with over 3.5 million visitors. Frank and Josephine Chen were two of those visitors. The Chen family lived in Central Florida, and as entrepreneurs in the States, owned a considerable amount of land near Walt Disney World. They had already been successful developers with their large housing project called Formosa Gardens. But they wanted to do something even more noteworthy, like building their very own theme park, just like the one they saw in China. So the Chens decided to partner up with the CTS and go in on a joint venture to bring that miniature theme park to Florida and build it on their own land. In December of 1991, the Chen's son George announced the project, stating to the Orlando Sentinel that the Florida Splendid China would be an outdoor educational museum, and isn't looking to compete with Disney or any other local attractions, rather complement them, as this was believed to be an enriching and educational experience. Groundbreaking soon began later that week, and through the next 24 months, 120 Chinese artisans were brought in to craft thousands of miniatures. Over $40 million would be spent on just these displays, from the 2,600-foot Great Wall of China made from over 6 million small bricks, to hand-painted works of art crafted with ancient techniques. By December of 1993, the 76-acre Splendid China, Florida was finished and ready for its grand opening. While the final construction cost was disputed by management, estimations put it at around $100 million, or around $211 million today. The park opened as a pretty interesting concept. At its core, it was a very high-budget outdoor miniature park. And to give them credit, the models were extremely well done and clearly had a lot of time and effort put into them. The models displayed China's 5,000-year-long history with key events and environments that represent those periods in time. And they were authentically recreated and did a pretty decent job at telling the history of China, at least the more clean version for an American audience. Guests could view some of the highlights like the Great Wall of China, the Jin Ancestral Temple, the 20-foot-tall Luzon Buddha statue, and the Tomb of the Terracotta Soldiers, along with many, many more. Around 60 in total. While there were no rides, the park would feature some live entertainment, hosted in 2 different theaters showcasing martial arts and impressive acrobatics. Along with the massive miniature grounds, there was also Chinatown, a faithful recreation of an authentic Chinese market. This area was actually free to enter and featured various shops where you can buy handmade goods from the park's in-house artisans, along with a bunch of other authentic merchandise. Additionally, there were 4 separate restaurants, all in different styles of Chinese cuisine. For the children, a small park was built, as well as an animatronics show built by Sally Dark Rides. The whole experience would be topped off by a pleasant evening atmosphere and on select nights, a fireworks show. All of this tied together a pretty decent experience, and after its grand opening, many praised the park for its unique level of cultural immersion and attention to detail. Originally, George Chen had anticipated 1 million visitors a year, with a ticket price of $23 a person. Now, in fairness, the success of the Chinese-based park showed precedence, and with the success of miniature parks over in Europe, well, this was promised to be a hit with families looking for some cultural entertainment, as well as a natural draw for Chinese tourists vacationing in Orlando. In reality, though, by the end of 1994, the park was only getting between 700 and 1,000 visitors through the gates per day. That worked out to be around 300,000 people for the whole year. That's pretty far off from their 1 million guests prediction, and even lower than some regional parks like Gatorland. This was due to, in part at least, all of the bad press the park had been suffering from, even before its opening operation. The main criticism came from Tibetan community leaders in the area, who said the park was whitewashing history. See, within Splendid China was a replica of Potala Palace, the place where the Dalai Lama was exiled from back in the late 1950s. This was after a decades-long invasion of Tibet that resulted in millions of their often peaceful people killed. It was now being praised as a significant Chinese landmark. So, understandably, the Tibetan people were very offended by this theme park, saying it ignored China's long history of human rights violations and was built here to present an inaccurate and pro-Chinese depiction of their history. People from Mongolia, Taiwan, and Eastern Turkestan also took issue with the park, claiming that it continues the oppression their people had seen from China for decades. Americans were also sensitive to the park, seeing it as a form of propaganda and a way to brainwash the youth. The Tiananmen Square protests were fresh in people's minds at the time, and it made sense that some people were hesitant to trust something that was built as a self-described physical brochure on why you should visit China, especially when the company behind it was in part funded by the government. Not long after the park opened, the Chen seemed to have had enough, and with conflicting viewpoints on how to run an amusement enterprise, they decided to sell their ownership stake to their development partner, the Chinese Tourism Service. The Chens continued to develop the nearby land though, opening a Comfort Suites along Highway 192 and selling it to the CTS. They also built a shopping plaza just a few feet down the road from Splendid China. This shopping village was actually totally themed inside and out, a complementing structure to the theme park down the road. But with the ownership now fully in the hands of the CTS, local leaders continued their protests. When the local paper asked the park's spokesperson about their relationship with the Chinese government, the spokesperson alluded to the fact that they didn't know the company was partially owned by the government, but later dismissed any serious involvement from them. By 1995, a group called Teachers Against Splendid China was formed, a group of teachers opposed to letting schools set up field trips to the park. Now, there was some opposition to this, claiming that ridding school field trips here would disallow some children's only opportunity to see at least replicas of some of the world's wonders. The organization ultimately got their way though, as in late 1995, all Pinellas County field trips were banned from visiting the park. This put another dent in the already struggling theme park, one that had been suffering from low attendance for years. To combat this, Splendid China opened another theater and upped their live performances, including ones that featured exotic animals. They also introduced seasonal events and increased their marketing budget with a $200,000 digital sign on Highway 192. The CTS also announced their intentions to develop some of the 300 acres owned by the Chens, which could include an expansion of hotel rooms and timeshares. This would never materialize. Despite all of this, the park continued to suffer from poor attendance. Reporter Mike Thomas put it in the most brutal terms when he wrote in a 1998 Orlando Sentinel article saying, quote, "If you don't like crowds, if you don't like small gatherings, if you don't like parties of two, this is your kind of place. Splendid China, Florida's forgotten theme park." By the millennium, attendance was still suffering, now down to 200 to 300 visitors a day, or around 90,000 people a year. Things were really bad, and it was reported that Splendid China was losing around $9 million a year. The park's president openly stated that they would consider selling the park if an appropriate offer was made. Apparently, there were a few bids, but nothing concrete. It was clear by now that the CTS wanted out of their Orlando theme park, and with the relentless pressure of debt and controversy, Splendid days seemed numbered. Apparently, there was also infighting. For years, the Chinese management clashed with the American park operations staff on how the park should be run. It seemed as though the Chinese corporate side of the business just didn't understand the American tourism market, and because of that, Splendid's president let the park fall into disrepair. In fact, that president was even sent back to China due to his gross mismanagement of funds. The tourism downturn following 9/11 didn't help things, and after several different managers tried to turn the ship around, by this point, it was all over. On December 30th, 2003, the park announced that they would close permanently, and a day later, the park shut its gates for the last time. Splendid China had only been open for 10 years. It was unknown as to what would happen with the park, as there was no official plan going forward, though I would imagine that the owners were hoping for a sale. Regardless, the theme park was left practically untouched and vacant after the gates had closed. By late 2004, the park held a large auction to try and get as much money out of the failed property. This included many of the miniatures that weren't already heavily damaged, mainly the Great Wall, which had been sold off in sections. Everything else was just left there to rot away. It didn't take long for people to start finding their way in and documenting the eerie state everything was left in. The following years saw a rapid decay of the miniatures and surrounding grounds. The hurricane season of 2004 caused some further damage, with the theaters torn up and the Chinatown street left in a surreal state of disrepair. The hotel that was also owned by the CTS and attached to Splendid China was shuttered not long after. By 2005, the owners finally got their wish, as an investment company had purchased the park and their hotel, along with 366 acres of land, all for $40.2 million. They were only interested in the land itself and stated that they would hold on to it for a while and plan a larger development along 192. They had no intentions of reopening the park and stated that it would be demolished by 2008. Meanwhile, Splendid China continued to crumble. That 2008 timeline came and went, and while there was some development on the north end of the property on a small patch of vacant land, the recession likely halted any further development. From the air, you can actually see just how massive this parcel of land is. At the top, you can see the former plot of Splendid China, then everything else that's slated for development. Vandalism continued to get worse as a fire broke out in 2007, and the crumbling exhibits were now covered with graffiti. Police were regularly called in, and news spread on how this derelict theme park was now a haven for vandals, thieves, and skateboarders. The buildings within had been absolutely ravaged over time, with the Florida foliage overtaking the vast miniature areas. The whole thing looked like a strange, massive wasteland of models. A few more years would pass until 2013, a full decade after the park had closed. It was then where developers finally got going with their project and announced the demolition of the remaining structures on their land, those being the old hotel and what was left of the Splendid China theme park. By this point, the site was in rough condition, with graffiti covering the heavily vandalized structures and the beautifully hand-painted murals. It was all a surreal post-apocalyptic state of a Chinese land at 1/15 the scale. In mid-2013, demolition finally began, and by the end of the year, just a few structures and the perimeter wall would remain. Everything else was turned into mounds of rubble, barely distinguishable from what they used to be. The former entrance would be blocked off by some of the defaced stone heads, which really just showed how far this property had fallen. A few more years would pass until 2016, when serious construction got going. It was announced that a massive hotel and condo development would occupy much of the 300 acres of land. This was later unveiled to be the Margaritaville Resort Orlando, and its size was impressive, consisting of a 186-room hotel, 451 cottages, 212 villas, as well as a shopping district and a water park. Splendid China's footprint was completely graded over by 2017. Today, the site has been completely built upon with the cottages portion of the Margaritaville Resort. The failure of Splendid China, Florida is really not that hard to believe. While it was a very detailed series of quality exhibits, and in some ways bringing true Chinese culture to Orlando, it was also just that. Just a few self-guided miniatures through the history of a far-off land. Unlike European tourists, which developers had cited as a gauge of interest, Americans vacationing in Orlando just weren't all that interested in something as education-heavy and frankly as dry as this was. The vibrant shows did help, but without any actual rides, the park was always going to struggle to lure over tourists from Disney, some of which were already getting their perceived cultural fix at Epcot's World Showcase. The fact is, people vacationing in Orlando don't want to go learn about some other country for an entire afternoon, especially when it involves them walking out in the hot Florida sun through some miniatures. That, coupled with a high ticket entry price and the never-ending controversy, just put Splendid China in a never-ending fight for survival. And it was a big fall from grace. Its $100 million construction cost sank to just $12.8 million in appraised value by 2003. It was, by all accounts, a massive failure. Today, though, there really isn't much left. The most prominent structure left is the perimeter wall, which does still exist, just looking very different. Really, the only remnant left is the Formosa Gardens Village, the shopping plaza that was built to architecturally complement the theme park next door. While the highly themed Winn-Dixie supermarket has closed, the rest of the plaza remains open as a very weird outlier in the area. Of course, the best remnant is the Splendid China in Shenzhen. The original park this was all based off of is still operating in China, and more or less is exactly the same as the one that was built in Florida. Personally, I can appreciate the intricacy of the miniatures, and I am a fan of models, so I'd probably have a good time exploring the park. Though I'd also have to wonder if I'm really getting my money's worth there, and ponder the ethics of visiting such a park that in some respects falsifies history and refuses to respect those ancestors who died. In the end, it's pretty crazy to think that the original park ended up having a twin 8,000 miles away, only for it to fail, sit abandoned for decades, and eventually be replaced by Jimmy Buffett's Margaritaville. It's quite the capitalism fate, isn't it? Speaking of Jimmy Buffett, if you want to see me try out the new Margaritaville cruise ship, I have a brand new review of it over on my second channel, Bright Sun Travels. You can go check it out in the top right corner or in the description. But if you want to see my main channel videos before anyone else and ad-free, well, they're always uploaded first on Nebula. Nebula is a great platform that's built by creators, and it shows. There you can find a host of all types of exclusive content called Nebula Originals, some of which I've been talking about recently on the channel, like City Beautiful's Great Cities. Recently, I've been watching Real Life Lore's Modern Conflicts, a show that beautifully breaks down how and why wars are started. It's a fascinating series, and one that I've been keeping up with to better be informed over the invasion of Ukraine. It's really high quality content from some of your favorite creators, all ad-free, and you won't find it anywhere but Nebula. In addition, there's also Nebula Classes, a great place to learn from your favorite creators. So if you're interested in signing up, for a limited time right now, you can get a lifetime membership to Nebula for just $300. That's all the great content you love on Nebula for as long as you and the platform exist. But if that's not for you, you can always get an annual subscription for as little as $30, which is 40% off the normal price if you click my link in the description below. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.